September of 1944, Albert Speer opened a railway report and saw something worse than bomb damage. He saw circulation failure. The factories were still standing. The mines were still digging. The armaments plants still had workers at the machines. But the coal was not arriving. The coke was not reaching the blast furnaces. The steel was not getting from the Ruhr to the shops that needed it. And the ammunition Germany still knew how to make was beginning to die in the space between production and delivery. That was the part Speer could not solve. He had rebuilt factories after bombing raids. He had scattered machine tools into smaller workshops. He had forced production through slave labor, emergency schedules, and every brutal workaround the Nazi state could command. But a railway network was different. You could hide a factory. You could not hide the bridge that carried half a region's freight across a river. You could move a workshop. You could not move the marshalling yard where hundreds of trains had to be sorted before the coal could roll. And somewhere on the Allied side of the war, a colonel had understood that before Speer did. His name was Richard D'Oyly Hughes. He was not famous for leading tanks. He did not command a bomber group. He did not invent a weapon that made newspaper headlines. He studied railway traffic. And Speer would later measure the damage he caused in the only military language that seemed large enough: 3 Panzer divisions. Not because Hughes destroyed more machines than they could, but because he found the joint where Germany's war machine stopped being a machine and became a body without blood. To understand why that mattered, you have to stop looking at German industry as factories on a map. That was how many people looked at it in the early war. Aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, synthetic fuel sites, steel mills, submarine yards. Every target had a roof. Every roof could be photographed. Every photograph could be marked with circles and arrows. It made sense. Bomb the plant that builds aircraft engines, and fewer aircraft engines come out. Bomb the ball-bearing works, and every rotating machine begins to suffer. Bomb the synthetic fuel refineries, and the Luftwaffe and the Panzer force run dry. The theory was clean. The targets were dramatic. The destruction could be seen from the air. But Germany did something industrial systems often do when they are wounded instead of broken. It adapted. Speer was very good at that. After he took over armaments production in 1942, he pushed the German war economy into a harsher, more rationalized shape. He dispersed vulnerable production. He moved work into smaller plants. He cannibalized machine tools from occupied Europe. He used forced and slave labor on a vast scale, and he kept production rising far longer than Allied planners expected. So the Allies would smash a factory, and months later, the output would reappear somewhere else. Not always fully, not without cost, not without pain, but enough. Enough to keep tanks coming off assembly lines. Enough to keep aircraft engines moving. Enough to keep shell casings feeding the front. That was the frustration. The bombs were doing damage. The damage was not yet making the German war economy collapse. Because the real target was not only where Germany made things, it was how Germany moved them. The Reichsbahn was Germany's national railway system, and by 1943 it was one of the most important military assets in Europe. It moved coal from mines to steel mills. It moved coke to blast furnaces. It moved steel to armaments plants. It moved ammunition, replacement parts, fuel, food, and men toward the fronts. At its height, The system operated roughly 55,000 locomotives and moved about 150,000 freight cars a day across nearly 30,000 route miles. That number sounds like strength. Hughes saw the opposite. He saw a system running so close to full capacity that strength had become brittleness. 80% utilization, 85% utilization. In a factory report, that looks efficient. In a railway network during wartime, it is a warning flare, because a system that full has no cushion. Every locomotive already has a job. Every yard is already processing cars. Every bridge is already carrying scheduled traffic. Every delay has somewhere to go. And when there is no empty space left inside a system, disruption does not stay local. It spreads. A yard is hit. Cars back up outside it. The main line begins to clog. The train behind the coal train waits. The locomotive assigned to another run never arrives. A steel mill that expected coke on Tuesday is still waiting on Friday. A furnace cools. A shop that expected steel billets receives nothing. A frontline depot that expected ammunition gets a telegram instead. This was Hughes's insight. He did not look at the German railway network as a list of targets. He looked at it as a set of flows. Where did coal have to pass? Where did the West German rail lines cross rivers? Which marshalling yards sorted the freight that fed the Ruhr? Where were locomotives serviced, fueled, inspected, and reassigned? Which bridges could be bypassed, and which ones, if destroyed together, would force so much traffic onto the remaining routes that the remaining routes would become targets too? The question was not, what can we bomb? The question was, where does the system have no room to breathe? That is a different kind of war thinking. It is not glamorous. It is not the view from a turret or a cockpit. It is the view from a traffic chart, a yard diagram, and a timetable. But in industrial war, timetables can become battlefields. Hughes had the right kind of mind for that battlefield. He had been trained in engineering. He understood railways not as scenery, but as living systems of load, sequence, capacity, maintenance, and delay. A bridge was not just a bridge. It was a compulsory decision point. A marshalling yard was not just a yard. It was a sorting organ. A locomotive servicing facility was not just a workshop. It was where movement itself was renewed. Cut enough of those organs at the same time, and the machine does not merely slow down, it chokes. The problem was persuading Allied commanders to believe that an unglamorous system could be a decisive target. By 1944, the Allied air campaign had strong rival theories. General Karl Spaatz believed the key was oil. Hit the synthetic fuel plants, and the German military would eventually lose the gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel it needed to fight. He was not wrong. The oil campaign would become devastating, but it worked cumulatively, and German industry fought back with repair, rationing, dispersal, and improvisation. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris believed in area bombing. Break German cities, burn the workforce out of their homes, shatter morale, and force the Reich to crack from inside. That campaign caused immense destruction and terrible civilian losses, but it did not break German armaments production when its strongest advocates said it would. Hughes's proposal sounded colder, less heroic, less symbolic, almost clerical. Bridges, marshalling yards, locomotive servicing points, rail junctions, traffic flow, not the crown jewels of the Reich, the plumbing. And military institutions do not always like being told that plumbing decides empires. Then came Overlord. In the spring of 1944, Dwight Eisenhower did not need a bombing theory that might become decisive someday. He needed the German army slowed before and after D-Day. If German panzer divisions could move quickly into Normandy, the Allied landing might be trapped against the sea. If rail lines across France and Belgium were broken in the right places, those same divisions could be delayed long enough for the beachhead to grow teeth. That made the transportation plan urgent. In April 1944, Eisenhower approved the attack on the transportation network feeding northern France and Belgium. The campaign began hammering marshalling yards, bridges, rail junctions, and lines that German reinforcements would need. By D-Day, Allied aircraft had flown more than 21,000 sorties against transportation targets in France and Belgium. Bridges over the Seine were dropped. Rail yards were cratered. Lines north of the Loire were cut and cut again until German repair crews were working faster and falling farther behind. And then the effect appeared where it mattered most, not in a communique, on the roads and rails leading toward Normandy. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, took about 17 days to reach the fighting from Belgium, a movement that should have taken only a few. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, moving from southern France through damaged rail routes and resistance sabotage, took nearly 3 weeks to cover a journey that under normal conditions might have taken days. Every delay mattered. A panzer division that arrives on June 7 can threaten a beachhead. A panzer division that arrives after the Allies have built roads, unloaded guns, landed armor, and deepened their perimeter is no longer striking a landing. It is attacking a growing army. That was the first proof. But France and Belgium were only the trial ground. The real test was Germany itself, because Hughes's logic was not just about protecting Normandy. It was about strangling the Reich by attacking the transport system that connected its industrial organs. By late summer and autumn of 1944, Allied air power began applying the transportation logic inside Germany at a scale Speer could not ignore. The Ruhr depended on coal movement. Steel depended on coke movement. Armaments depended on steel movement. The army depended on the armaments, fuel, and ammunition reaching the front. Everything depended on trains. And the trains began failing faster than Germany could repair them. This is the difference between damage and overwhelm. Germany had survived damage. A raid tore open a yard. The Reichsbahn filled craters. Workers relayed track. Signals were patched. Traffic was rerouted. The system absorbed the hit. That was damage. Overwhelm is different. Overwhelm is when the bridge you reroute to is already carrying too much traffic. Overwhelm is when the yard that should receive the backlog is also under repair. Overwhelm is when the locomotive needed for one coal train is trapped behind another train waiting for another damaged junction. Overwhelm is when every workaround creates a new target. By autumn 1944, Speer's reports began reading less like industrial accounting and more like a medical chart. Coal deliveries to German industry, which had averaged around 7.5 million tons per month in the first half of the year, fell to roughly 4 million tons in October. By December, they were under 2 million. The mines had not vanished. The coal was not moving. Steel production followed. Blast furnaces went cold, not because every furnace had been bombed, because the coke needed to keep them alive did not arrive in time. Armaments output began to fall after reaching its peak in the summer. not because Germany had suddenly forgotten how to build weapons, because the inputs no longer reached the places that turned them into weapons. That is why Speer understood the meaning faster than many soldiers did. He was watching the economy fail from the production side. A plant still had machines, a shop still had workers, a depot still had orders, but the connecting tissue was being cut, and once the connections failed, every strength became isolated. At the front, the same collapse had another name: shortage. Ammunition trains arrived late. Replacement parts sat in rail yards that could not sort them. Fuel allocations existed on paper, while the actual fuel moved too slowly to matter. A tank battalion that needed fuel every 3 days could not fight on a 6-day delivery rhythm. It did not fight at half strength. It stopped. That is the brutal secret of logistics. Some systems do not degrade neatly. They cross a threshold. Below that threshold, a fighting unit is not slightly weaker. It is immobile. It is silent. It is waiting beside equipment it cannot move and guns it cannot feed. Field commanders saw this before the map admitted it. By October, German formations in the West were fighting at the end of a supply chain no one could predict with confidence. Ammunition 1 week, fuel the next, spare parts maybe never. Walter Model could still command. German units could still fight. The tactical skill had not disappeared, but skill cannot conjure shells out of a stalled rail system. Then came the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. Hitler wanted one more armored blow through the West, a thrust through the forest, a drive to Antwerp, a political shock large enough to split the Allies. On paper, the plan demanded speed. In reality, it demanded fuel Germany could barely move. The offensive gambled that armored columns would capture Allied fuel dumps before their own tanks ran dry. That gamble failed. American demolitions, bad roads, traffic jams, resistance, weather, and combat all mattered. But underneath the whole offensive sat the same structural truth Hughes had exposed. Germany could still assemble striking power. It could not reliably sustain movement. The war was being lost between the depot and the front, between the mine and the mill, between the mill and the factory, between the factory and the army. That was the battlefield Hughes had chosen. The tragedy and the genius of it is that the battlefield was invisible until it began to kill everything connected to it. No single photograph could show the whole effect. A bombed bridge showed a broken span. A cratered yard showed twisted rails. A stopped train showed cars waiting on a line. But the real damage lived in the cascade. A furnace cooling because a coke shipment missed its window. A gun crew rationing shells because railheads were empty. A Panzer column sitting still because fuel that existed somewhere in Germany was useless if it could not arrive here. That was not spectacle. That was suffocation. And suffocation was harder to repair than wreckage. Speer knew this. He had every reason to exaggerate the problems caused by Allied bombing after the war, and every reason to present himself as a technocrat trapped inside a criminal regime rather than one of its managers. He was convicted at Nuremberg for his use of slave labor and served 20 years in Spandau prison. His memoirs would later be challenged for evasion and self-protection. But on the economic point, the records line up. The transportation collapse was real. The timing was real. The decline in coal movement, steel output, and armaments production in late 1944 was real. And when Speer reached for the comparison to 3 Panzer divisions, he was not handing Hughes a compliment. He was naming the size of the wound. 3 Panzer divisions meant concentrated German striking power. Tens of thousands of men, hundreds of armored vehicles, artillery, maintenance, fuel trains, staffs, radio nets. The kind of force Germany had used to change the map of Europe. Speer was saying that a colonel with traffic charts had done damage on that scale, not by winning a tank battle, by making tank battles harder for Germany to fight at all. That is why Hughes's story matters, because it changes what a weapon can be. A weapon can be a bomber. A weapon can be a bridge demolition. A weapon can be a division of armor moving at dawn. But in an industrial war, a weapon can also be a correct diagnosis, a chart that shows where coal must pass, a flow analysis that reveals a system has no spare capacity, a target list built not around what looks important, but around what everything else secretly depends on. Hughes understood the Reichsbahn as a system before the Reich could defend it as one. The Germans knew how to operate railways. They had long experience moving armies by rail. Their railway engineers could repair track, rebuild bridges, and keep supply lines moving under pressure. But operating a system is not the same as understanding how to break it. To operate it, you need crews, engines, schedules, and discipline. To break it, you need to know where delay becomes paralysis, where rerouting becomes overload, where overload becomes backlog, where backlog becomes factory stoppage, where factory stoppage becomes battlefield weakness. That was the difference. Germany saw railways as a tool of movement. Hughes saw a network of dependencies, and he found the places where those dependencies could be attacked faster than they could heal. He did not become a household name. That is normal for people who win battles inside maps and memoranda. The air crews were visible. Their courage was visible. Their losses were terrible and visible. The analyst's work was not. It lived in target files, traffic diagrams, intelligence estimates, and bombing priorities. But Speer saw it from the other CZ. A man trying to keep a war economy alive recognized the man who had found its weak arteries. And that recognition is what gives the story its weight. It was not that one analyst defeated Germany. No single campaign did that. The oil attacks mattered. The ground armies mattered. The Soviet advance mattered. The Allied logistics machine mattered. The sacrifices of the air crews mattered enormously. But Hughes helped identify the point where all that pressure could become irreversible. Not merely destructive, systemic. Germany could rebuild a factory. It could not rebuild time. It could not rebuild missed deliveries. It could not rebuild a cooled furnace in the hour a front needed steel. It could not rebuild a fuel train already late to a tank column that had burned its last gallons. That is what a transportation network gives an army, not just movement, timing. And when timing dies, strength arrives too late to be strength. By the end of 1944, the Reich still had men. It still had weapons. It still had commanders capable of punishing mistakes. But its industrial body was no longer moving blood the way a war body must. The coal was late. The steel was short. The shells were rationed. The fuel was trapped in the wrong places. And somewhere behind the bombing directives was the mind of a railway engineer who had understood the essential truth. You do not always have to destroy the thing your enemy makes. Sometimes you only have to stop it from arriving. That was the wound Richard D'Oyly Hughes found, not in the armor, not in the factory wall, not in the flag, in the timetable. And once he found it, The German war machine did not need to be knocked down all at once. It only had to be made late, again and again and again, until every late train became a silent gun, a cold furnace, and a Panzer division that existed on paper but could not arrive as power. That is why Speer remembered him, because the colonel did not attack Germany's strength. He attacked the road between its strengths. And in modern war, that road can be the whole war.